It's a great honor and privilege for me to introduce to you someone I have long admired and who was for a decade the spiritual head of the World Anglican Communion, of which my own church in Ireland was a member. As most of you know, Rowan Williams is a Welshman, born into a Welsh-speaking family of Presbyterians in Swansea, and was the first non-English cleric since the Reformation to be elevated to the See of Canterbury. He has served the worlds of church and academy with uncommon distinction over many years, and is now Master of Magdalen College in the other Cambridge. In preparing this short introduction, I realized that we had some unexpected things in common. This is my own blundering attempt at the paradox of empathy. We are both from the so-called Celtic fringes of the British state, which is absolutely the best place to come from. We were both members of disestablished Anglican churches, one in Wales and the other in Ireland, which I think it's fair to say over the course of history decidedly failed the empathy test. And we both became attracted to a life of scholarship informed by religious and historical inquiry. And we both now find ourselves leading academic institutions with strong religious roots. Alas, I have not yet been asked to be Archbishop of Canterbury. But it can surely only be a matter of time. I know you're not allowed to comment on your successors. Rowan Williams' service as Archbishop of Canterbury was not without its challenges. As the global Anglican Communion threatened to tear itself apart over issues surrounding the rights of women and gays, liberal and conservative theologies, and different conceptions of political and economic justice, he nevertheless courageously spoke his mind, and the Church's mind, over the Iraq War, the evils of torture, the deepening inequality of wealth, and the civil and legal rights of other religious traditions, including Islam. His time as Archbishop was marked by a deep commitment to church unity and by a thoughtful and persistent response to the challenges of secularism and materialism. Away from the glare of controversy which religious leaders cannot easily avoid, he helped build new congregations, increase humanitarian aid, and advocate for the importance of education for all social classes. He was also relentlessly honest, humble, and self-effacing, qualities not always in abundant supply among religious leaders or academic leaders. More pertinent to this afternoon's event, Dr. Williams is also a distinguished and accessible theologian, perhaps the most significant theologian of his generation writing in English. One mark of his theological work is its breadth and interdisciplinarity. He has written widely across field and period. His first work was in modern Russian Orthodox thought, then ancient Christian thought, and later Christian mysticism. His work is generally informed by knowledge of contemporary philosophy and a deep love of literature. As a religious leader, he has written extensively at the intersection of religion and politics and interreligious dialogue. He was in downtown New York in 9/11. Less well known is that he is also a highly regarded poet. Welsh-born Anglican priests seem to have a special gift of the muse. George Herbert, William Williams, Pentecoelen, the great hymn writer, and the incomparable R.S. Thomas, who was nominated for the Nobel Prize the year it was awarded to Seamus Heaney. This is one over for the Irish. Rowan Williams' Tanner Lectures offers a fresh example of his unusual breadth and wide reading. They're informed by recent conversations in neuroscience, phenomenology, ethics, and Anglo-American philosophy, with a little bit of Shakespeare, Russian literature, and British science fiction thrown in for good measure. Almost everything he writes seems to engage diverse and unexpected conversation partners, and these lectures are no exception. And as everywhere in his work, the overarching theme has something to do with the subject's necessary openness to the judgment of others, to being formed and challenged and transformed by its encounter with others. It's this which constitutes the paradox of empathy that he takes as his title. Is empathy really just feeling what another feels? Or might we understand it as a recognition that we cannot feel what another feels as a willingness to let the mystery of that encounter with the other transform us, and to work with and learn from the other on that basis. In that sense, then, empathy is a relational process of engagement through the mysterious encounters of embodied selves. It's always a work in progress. His first lecture began with a critique of a relatively flat neuroscientific description of empathy that is useful as far as it goes, but which Williams sees as unhelpfully leveraged by its author, Baron Cohen, into a self-confident but naive ethical reflection. Baron Cohen regards empathy erosion, the incapacity to either recognize or resonate with another's distress, as definitional of evil. But Rowan Williams showed us this cannot be the whole story of evil. In particular, it undervalues the role of culture, power, and language. Recognizing and engaging with another's pain is one thing. Working for and working out justice in a very complicated world is quite another. Yesterday, he used the example of the Bereaved Families Forum in Israel-Palestine. Certainly, these Israeli and Palestinian families and their work for peace are rooted in empathic relation. They are bound by their suffering and the mutual recognition of that suffering. But something more than this is needed when determining borders, the status of settlements, the rights of refugees, and so on. Empathy initiates the ethical, it doesn't exhaust it. I was reminded of my own early life in Northern Ireland when empathy across religious and ethnic divisions was in short supply, and where no mere desire to understand the other could ever etherize centuries of differences over identity, access to power, economic opportunity, cultural expression, and colonial legacy. Empathy, even where it existed, was never quite enough. Last evening, to use his own words, he began his work of tidying up the concepts, initially through the writing of Edith Stein, the Carmelite nun who died at Auschwitz. He argued that empathy understood as the simple breaking down of some barrier between self and other is really too simple a notion. Empathy is, in fact, rather more like recognizing that the self is incomplete without the other, as well as the recognition that any sense of another's emotion must be likewise incomplete. It's more like humility than fellow feeling. Empathy isn't simply identification or co-option or absorption of another's emotions. It is rather the recognition both of a mutual opacity and of the necessity of the other in constructing any just world. In a memorable phrase, he stated, quote, "There is no shortcut into the alien heart of the neighbor, any more than into the obscure territory that is my own embedded selfhood." In short, neither cold-blooded neuroscience, nor self-indulgent sentimentality, nor any generic theological statement about the breadth of divine empathy can quite get to the heart of the empathic response as involved in attention to difference. The truth is that we may have no idea of what another is really enduring, even if that is no argument for not trying to find out. How then can we understand an empathic stance that is grounded in something more morally compelling than mere brain rhythms and the well-intentioned but ultimately vacuous pretense that the other is simply an extension of ourselves? Further, how can an empathic stance work from the private to the public? These are some of the subjects of tonight's lecture entitled Myself a Stranger, Empathy and Loss. Please warmly welcome once again Dr. Rowan Williams.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for coming again. It's always the lecturer's great anxiety on the second of any lecture series to see if anybody has bothered to come back. I'm going to begin tonight with a quotation from one of the philosophers who has most influenced and inspired me for the last 30 or more years, a philosopher whose name and presence here is well known to all of you, and it is a very particular privilege to be able to acknowledge Professor Stanley Cavell and express my gratitude for all the service that the service that he has given to the intellectual world in so many ways over so many years. And my quotation is from the concluding section of The Claim of Reason. With material objects, all I claim or assume is that I see them. It is the most natural assumption in the world. So where does the assumption come from according to which I must have correctly identified you as a human being? From some such fact as that my identification of you as a human being is not merely an identification of you, but with you. This is something more than merely seeing you. Call it empathic projection. Professor Cavell thus sums up what is involved in recognizing another person as another person. And a little later in that same concluding section of the Claim of Reason, he connects this with his extraordinary, groundbreaking essay on King Lear. In that essay, he had argued that acknowledging is more than knowing, in the sense that it is not a feat of cognition, but involves a call upon me to express or act upon what I know. And failing to do this is to render any language about knowing vacuous. The question of how I know and acknowledge the other's humanity thus turns into a question about what I am as a subject, summoned to witness to the significance of such a question. How is it that I cannot, it seems, claim genuinely to know where human others are concerned, without admitting in the same moment that I am under some sort of pressure to act in particular sorts of ways? If I fail to act in those ways, my claim to know is clearly open to challenge. And that pressure does not come from some specific feature of the other which absolutely grounds or justifies my acknowledgement. Paradoxically, it is what I am that makes acknowledgement of the other imperative and unavoidable. This assurance is mine, comes only from me, writes Cavell. And with characteristic teasing seriousness, he thus inscribes the moral awareness of the other precisely within the self's own lack of assurance about otherness. What I know is that I am under a duty or answering a call, not that I have grounds for ascribing subjectivity to another. Knowing the otherness of another, a sentient other, is having duties. And Cavell notes how very misleading that expression empathic projection can be if it suggests either that the other is simply like me, as if I'd worked out by analogy to myself what it must be to be the other, and have to keep on doing this calculation case by case, or that knowledge of a person is a feat in which I make a leap across the chasm separating the brute there-ness of a material other from their imagined inner world. I take the risk of assuming they have an inside like me. Now, the pertinence of this to our general discussion is that, as Professor Cavell goes on to say, duty to an other does not depend on some kind of absolute mutual transparency, some capacity to see into the heart of another, or some capacity totally to expose our own hearts in order to make the appropriate claim on another. There are things about ourselves we cannot communicate, and things we cannot know about another. Thus, there is no alternative to acknowledging not only the claim of the other, but the mutual impenetrability of states of mind. Since, as Cavell observes, if the other is another mind, I am another mind to another. If I'm puzzled about the existence of others, they're equally puzzled about me. And this can be expressed more pregnantly by saying, I quote again, there is no human alternative to the possibility of tragedy. The great tragic dramas of Shakespeare put before us on Cavell's analysis a range of narratives about the summons to acknowledgement and the failure of acknowledgement. Failure in recognizing something in oneself that would enable the recognition of another, King Lear. Failure in yielding to what we actually know in the insane hope of knowing more than we can, Othello. The heart of the tragic is not that we fail to know each other or to exercise appropriate levels of empathic feeling, but that we mistrust or deny the knowledge we always already have of others in and through our knowing of ourselves as summoned to acknowledgement. What is tragic is our failure to know what we know, ourselves. And the point of tragic drama, or other varieties of tragic art, is not so much to persuade us to feel more acutely for others, but to reacquaint us with both the unavoidable limits of our knowledge of others and the unavoidable givenness of our being involved in that knowing and its call to acknowledgement. Tragedy plots a location for me as a subject addressed or acted upon, challenged both by my lack of ground for assurance of the knowledge of others and by the question of how I am myself known or acknowledged. And by charting what happens when I withdraw from being seen and known, and when I refuse to recognize myself as called upon, tragedy charts the mechanics of self-destruction, self-loss. It's worth noting how many unexpected echoes of Edith Stein's analysis are echoed, if in a very different idiom, in Professor Cavell. Like Stein, he sees the empathic position as a stance in which I acknowledge my own limit, in grasping that I am seen or addressed and that I cannot contain the whole of what addresses me. Both define empathy not as an appropriation of the other's state of mind, but as a moment of recognizing that I am an other to other irreducible subjects, and that my self-awareness is therefore implicated from the first with these irreducible others. Both want to dissolve the fantasy of an unproblematic primordiality of perceiving, which does not involve awareness of possible alien perspectives. Stein does not directly discuss tragedy, but her stress on the fallibility of self-perception resonates with Cavell's insistence that our variegated failures to acknowledge the other appropriately entail a destructive failure in self-knowing. As I noted yesterday, the empathic stance is not dependent on success or failure in another's ability to present herself. And Stein's zero point of orientation is not something to which I conclude as a result of following through a set of decisive clues. It's what I find given in my own self-awareness, in the I that is constituted by the alien perception I can't contain or control. Just as for Cavell, the presence and call of the other is not an intellectually solid discovery at the end of an investigation, but something inseparable from the question of who or what I am, the question of whether I am myself seen or known. Material enough here for the tragic conceived as self-misapprehension, bound in with the refusal of acknowledgement. Cavell has more to say about tragic drama, in particular, in his essay on Lear. Drama halts our course of action. It imposes a stilling of our urge to intervene in the suffering of another by creating a world of reference in which I absolutely and literally cannot have a place. Someone who shouted a warning to a figure on stage during the course of a tragic drama, "Don't believe him, she's alive," would be following the conventions of pantomime, not tragedy. We'd assume that they did not know how to behave at a serious dramatic performance. I'm afraid I can't quite resist here my favorite anecdote about this, which is told by the actor Gareth Armstrong, when on tour in Africa as a young man in the 1970s, having eaten a rather doubtful omelette at supper before a production of Romeo and Juliet, he discovered in the last scene, as he was about to embrace the supposed corpse of Juliet, that the call of nature was too strong for him, and disappeared into the bushes nearby. Juliet woke up and looked around apprehensively and with some bewilderment. And a voice from the audience called out, "She think you dead. You go find another man." People don't know how to behave at dramatic performances. But what I see as a spectator of tragedy is a narrative that unfolds inexorably, the same every time. Lear will always banish Cordelia. Othello will always believe Iago, in a way I cannot influence, let alone heal. I quote again at length, "The audience is free of the circumstance and passion of the characters, but that freedom cannot reach the arena in which it could become effective. The actors are determined, not because their words and actions are dictated and their future sealed, but because if the dramatist has really peopled a world, the characters are exercising all the freedom at their command, and specifically, failing to. Specifically, not exercising it or ceding it once and for all. They are, in a word, men and women. We owe them the same duty we owe any other subjects. But the fact that this is dramatic representation means that I cannot exercise this duty. In the most serious sense, I cannot be myself here, or rather, I am myself only in the recognition of the most radical gap imaginable between me and the other, the recognition that, quote once more, I cannot do and suffer what it is another's to do and suffer. And here the paradox is, for Cavell, that human solidarity begins in this, not in affirmations about shared experience. The shared experience that most matters is the recognition of human limit and irreducible mutual strangeness. Without this, we're constantly, subtly lured into one or another variety of instrumentalizing the other, into a moral and political culture that's primarily about seeking reinforcement for intensities of feeling, and is only too grateful to do this by appropriating and so domesticating the suffering of another subject or group of subjects. Understanding the function of drama in a Cavellian sense is something to do with avoiding the corrosive drama of an uncriticized ego. It's not exactly textbook tragedy, generating pity and terror. Cavell argues that the significant element of catharsis is the purification of everything that would take our attention away from that present moment of helplessness before the other. I cannot change the suffering that's in front of me, not even by trying to make it mine, especially not by trying to make it mine. And to go on from this discussion a step or two, this implies that I emerge from the tragic drama not as someone who's acquired a new set of emotional experiences, and congratulate myself on how sensitive I'm feeling. I emerge first as a questioned subject, someone whose identity has been challenged, and second, as a subject learning to reimagine solidarity, not as fellow feeling, but as accompaniment, attention, humility, and patience. I have been required by the presentation of suffering as tragic drama, both to face the limits of my understanding and to challenge the refusals of my will. And I have begun to grasp that the effective response I must now make to the sort of suffering where I am not helpless, as I am in the audience of King Lear, is one in which I recognize the alienness of the other who lays claim to my support and compassion, and so become ready to take time to view and reflect on the actual conditions of their suffering, and to hear what their perspective, uniquely, lets them see and know. It's this wariness of just encouraging people to acquire a fresh set of experiences and a new level of sensitivity that lies behind a brief but very dense and provocative essay by Julian Rose, the British Hegelian philosopher, about Auschwitz. What, she asks, should the visitor to Auschwitz come away with? A sense of identification with immeasurable anguish? An individual worry about whether I could have done this, been complicit in this? Both these are problematic, Rose maintains. They simply reinforce the uneasiness of an individual consciousness and fail to repair the breach between law and morality, which is the difficult heart of the atrocity. Rather, she says, we need to go away with the question of how civic agents can allow such things to happen. What is the agency we might have that might reshape what are proclaimed as political givens? A question which breaks down the barrier between public and private selves, which, according to Rose, encourages a fundamentally sentimental response, denying responsibility. What matters, she argues, is to grasp the gulf that has opened up between, quote, ourselves as moral agents and ourselves as social actors. And this connects with what she has to say about the ethics of Emmanuel Levinas and Simone Weil. Angry angels, as she describes them, for whom justice is an annihilation of self for the sake of the other. A kind of transcendental justice supervenes over mere law. Supernatural and sacrificial good is the only true alternative to plain evil. The acting self encounters the overwhelming claim of the other and is thus repulsed in its efforts to invade or conquer the reality it confronts. The summons to ethical response is presented as a summons to substitute oneself for the other, answering the cry of the other's suffering by abandoning one's own defended position and adopting theirs. To attend to listen to the voice of the other is radically to silence the self. But Julian Rose shows in a densely argued discussion how this, in itself profound protest against violence and the incursions of the rapacious ego, can itself exhibit a residual violence, which appears in Simone Weil's caricatures of Judaism and Levinas's repudiation of Weil's Christianity, and also in their passion for an absolute justice which seems not to relate to the specific and finite issues of human persons. The appeal to substitution, by insisting on the evil, the intrinsic evil of the ego's perspective, nudges us once again to what I called last night the derealizing of actual contingent suffering. To respond only to the cry of anguish and to respond by self-annihilation or self-abjection obscures questions about what agency we have or might have, and how agency is thought, learned, conserved, fostered, and negotiated with other agents. All of this is what Rose understands law to entail, the learning of what it is to live with others. And the refusal of such learning is for her its own kind of violence. Julian Rose thus stands with Stanley Cavell in concentrating our attention on the repeatedly and necessarily frustrated task of learning to read the state of other subjects. For both of them, the serious engagement of seeking to understand another's suffering becomes a no less serious self-interrogation. Specifically, for Rose, an interrogation about how I understand my involvement in law, in public negotiated agency, which will entail not radical sacrificial identification or substitution, but the forming of a shared space of responsibility, in which the well-being of another is not referred to someone else's agenda. It connects a little bit to what emerged in the discussion last night about the creation of shared language, the shared world, in the effort to negotiate mutual incomprehensions. And what is sacrificial in this context is not the annihilation or abjection of the self that Rose fears and questions in Weil and Levinas, but the abandonment of a longing for perfect mutual transparency in our relations, and the acceptance of the tragic difficulty of honest relation, personal and political. Empathic interaction here means a vigilant sensitivity to what I don't know about another, which intensifies my willingness to learn and to work towards a lawful justice that secures the place of another. And in so securing the other, I secure the possibility that I shall be questioned and changed by that other, precisely because I don't contain or comprehend them. I continue, in Edith Stein's terms, to constitute and be constituted in that reciprocity, that recursive or reflexive sympathy. The paradox at the heart of the understanding of empathy, which I've been sketching with the help of Stein, Cavell, and Rose, is that the empathic stance involves a sensibility that puts in question not so much my awareness of another's suffering or other emotional state, as my understanding of my own interiority. And this takes us back to some of the issues touched on in the first of these lectures. Baron Cohen argues that the extremes of human cruelty have to do with major malfunctionings of neural circuitry which disable our appropriate cognitive and affective responses to pain. And late on in his book, he discusses candidates to whom we might want to ascribe what he calls super-empathy. In both contexts, the governing assumption is that empathy is essentially the capacity to read the emotional state of another person, and failing to do this produces either cruelty or defensive detachment of the kind associated with autistic conditions. High capacity is high responsiveness to the state of another person, and also in some circumstances the ability to verbalize it sensitively and accurately. Baron Cohen notes in passing that people with a low empathy quotient are predictably bad reporters on their own state. As you lose your empathy, he says, you may also lose your awareness that you have poor empathy. The double-mindedness that belongs to empathy, that is, being able to see the condition of others as well as yourself, must also entail some capacity to see yourself through the eyes of others, so that self-awareness and other awareness belong together. A concession to the kind of perspective I've been arguing for, but a concession and a recognition which actually make the whole question much more intricate than Baron Cohen's treatment implies. The use of the term double-mindedness is instructive here. Remember Sue Gerhardt's observation with which I began, that the areas of the brain associated with the recognition of the emotions of others are also associated with those aspects of our linguistic competence that have to do with spotting irony, double meaning, verbal slips, and so on. The area we are dealing with, it seems, is something to do with a particular kind of distancing from obvious and immediate impressions, in suspending what looks like or feel like primary sensations. In the sense, we can say that empathy is intimately connected with both imagination and irony, a standing back from the absolute givenness of supposed primary emotion. Raymond Tallis, whom I quoted last night, notes the impressive versatility, as he calls it, of the temporoparietal junction in the right cranial hemisphere in its contribution both to putting oneself in another's shoes, and so judging the intentions and perspectives of another, and the sense of belonging in one's own body, which, as Tallis characteristically puts it, is essential for putting your own shoes on. The versatility of this brain area is worth underlining because it is tempting in the context of some contemporary discussion to conclude that empathy is essentially just a heightened emotional vulnerability to others, rather than something interlocking with a nuanced sense of one's own physicality. And the risk in this is to suppose that intensity of feeling is in itself an ethically positive thing. Baron Cohen comes close to this in his treatment of the claim by another neuroscientist that a Buddhist monk might be considered as super empathetic on the grounds that his brain scans showed him to be hyperactive, quote, hyperactive in the empathy circuit when viewing other people's facial expressions, but also untroubled by his own pain or discomfort. Baron Cohen argues that this means the absence of a normal or appropriate response to pain. In a situation of profound suffering, we don't need someone else's calm, but a sign of sympathetic understanding. I'm not so sure. There can be no doubt that what I'm likely to need in moments of profound suffering is the assurance that another knows that it is suffering that is going on, and such assurance is most often given by signs that another person feels shocked or grieved. Yet if we are talking about more than a momentary flash of mutual understanding, what will change the situation is not a mirroring emotion, but a process involving a new apprehension of the position and possibilities of both the sufferer and the witness. The empathic observer finds his world altered by acknowledging the reality of the other's pain and becomes aware of what he is not, echoing Stein's formulation, aware that he is not the other, that he is in important ways not ready to respond appropriately to the other. But an aspect of this is a measure of detachment, precisely a measure of detachment from immediate emotional response. The Buddhist monk referred to by Baron Cohen's colleague is clearly practiced in disentangling his own states of feeling from the experiences of others, and thus used to suspending the immediacy and imperative quality of his own sensations. It's not necessarily a matter of refusing to attend to those sensations. Indeed, it may require a far more demanding kind of attention to them, a patient, exploratory querying of them. But it does involve a refusal to accept them as authoritative. Hence the paradox I've been sketching. An empathic response to another's condition challenges some sorts of emotional intensity rather than just reinforcing it. Empathic understanding is grasping something of my location in the midst of other centers of experience, the worlds of others, to learn a new level of scrutiny of myself and my environment. And it's also an aspect of learning to live in the world as an intelligent body. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in his series of brief lectures published as The World of Perception, takes us through a careful analysis of certain sorts of emotional exchange so as to establish that it is in the experience of coming to understand emotion in self and other that we discover ourselves as bodies that bear meaning. He describes the familiar sight of watching someone becoming angry. The physical signs appear, louder speech, gesticulating. Where, he asks, does this anger exist? Nowhere but in the body, in the physical space we share. I quote, "Anger inhabits him, and it blossoms on the surface of his pale or purple cheeks." If we then think about our own anger, we have to acknowledge that it likewise has no place but the body we inhabit, and that is inhabited by this or that emotion, and is in confrontation here and now with another embodied person. Quote from Merleau-Ponty again, "This anger does not lie beyond my body, directing it from without. If I cannot dissociate the emotion I read in another from the physical expression of it, I recognize my own embodied and thus limited, spatially situated sensing of the environment and my felt response to it in a more adequate way." And Merleau-Ponty goes on to underline the way in which a human infant appears to be able to identify emotional signals in the bodies and faces of others from the earliest moments of its existence, long before there could be any question of a process of deducing mental activity on the basis of some kind of analogical reasoning. Babies, on the whole, don't argue, "I feel like this when I look like that other person, therefore that other person must feel as I do when I look like that." Our own inner life appears as something worked out with a prior awareness of the embodied intelligence of others. We decode the physicality of others before we know ourselves. Or better, we come to know ourselves in the process of learning to read the other and relate to them, moving, as Sue Gerhardt spells out, from simply assuming that the emotional states of others are the same as mine or continuous with mine, to the recognition of real difference, the separating out of a sense of my own emotional center from the imperfectly differentiated environment of embodied feeling in which the infant is moving. Our problem is not that we somehow need to be delivered from a primitive solipsism into awareness of and relation to others, as if we began in a state of isolated self-awareness and needed to be convinced of something out there, less clear and perspicuous than our sense of self. The challenge and the source of many of our relational ills is instead what arises from a sense of the fragility of my own interiority, leading me either to push away or to try and absorb the alien reality of another state of mind, or indeed, as in the case of autistic conditions, to develop strategies for screening out stimuli from the environment. Empathic intelligence, then, is not so much a leap of intuition from one soul to another as the skill or habit of perspective, understanding myself as a body from whose position I cannot move, a body which therefore very literally needs other bodies interacting with it in order to know anything, including itself. If we can learn to speak of empathic understanding more in terms of this constitutive human orientation than as a particular skill of penetrating or identifying with the interior state of another, we may avoid some of the risks I've been noting. And the fundamental difficulty with many contemporary approaches is that they present empathy almost as a special and interesting extra dimension to our habitual consciousness. Baron Cohen calls it an underutilized resource, something we haven't really been aware of prior to the cultural analyses of recent years and the fresh neurological discoveries that locate it more precisely in our brain structures. Not long after I'd finished the first draft of these lectures, I came across a new book describing adventures in empathy and how exciting they could be. Now it seems we know both why empathy matters so much, because of conflicts that can't be resolved unless we see the other person's or community's point of view, and how it is shaped and developed or frustrated in our neurological history, and this gives it a new and special place. And part of my problem is the lurking banality in all this. If only people could see each other's point of view. Well, indeed. But what I've been arguing here is that the sheer capacity, however well nurtured and refined, to project yourself into another's state of mind or absorb into yourself the emotion of another subject is not a panacea for human ills. Perhaps more seriously, it ends up narrowing, even trivializing, the significance of the complex processes by which we learn how to be subjects in all those exchanges of recognition that surround us from before we are even conscious. Empathy, presented as a new and exciting adventure for the human consciousness, encourages us to ignore the more pressing need to recognize adequately how empathic elements are involved in the formation of consciousness itself. And I've used Stein and Cavell to spell out what that might begin to look like. The framework I've tried to outline enables us, I think, to see how and why incomprehension is, in certain contexts, a more genuinely empathic response than hasty or sentimental assimilation. A fuller account of empathy, in other words, will show how it mandates silence as well as communication, hesitation as well as engagement. Many contemporary appeals to empathy are often, in fact, little more than reminders of the need for patience, emotional intelligence, and self-awareness, rather than, to borrow the phraseology of one popular book, revolutionary new possibilities for human interaction. What is significantly new is indeed, as writers like Baron Cohen have argued, the scientific mapping that has developed. And as we've seen, it links the range of behaviors and attitudes we call empathic with capacities for reading ambiguity and discerning differences between appearance and substance, or surface meanings and deeper ones. And, at least as importantly, it has helped to identify some of the developmental points at which the usual unfolding of empathic habits may be frustrated. It's enabled us to create a far clearer picture of the relational and environmental, including social factors, that encourage dysfunctional responses, failure to reckon with the emotions of other subjects, and so on, factors that in effect erode the sense of self. The neurological picture that has emerged reinforces the more intuitive case for seeing our culture as imaginatively impoverished in its focus on instrumental rationality. A reinforcement spelled out in formidable detail by Ian McGilchrist in his remarkable work, The Master and His Emissary, which also has some challenging things to say about not only a science, but an art in which emotional register is marginalized. It may be that in a culture already fragmented by a centuries-old trend towards the tightly focused instrumentality and close-range problem-solving of the left brain, we need the neuroscientific perspective, however naive it may sometimes appear, to help us confront a widespread cultural pathology. To be able to identify with more precision how specific impairments of brain function are visible in various kinds of failure to read and recognize the mental and emotional states of others, is at least to be made aware of the question of what we regard as adequate or good functioning. We're brought back firmly to the theme of the inadequacy of any view of the human which begins from a self-sufficient subjectivity, a given and unchallengeable set of individual needs, and so on. We are brought back to the multiple oddities and ironies of what it is to be a body, a question whose deceptive simplicity dissolves fast once we address how it is that we form concepts of depth and dimensionality that allow us to chart our way through a material world. We are brought back to the many-layered character of communication among humans and to the centrally important fact of its incompleteness. We are brought back to both tragedy and comedy, we might say, to the diverse effects of our inescapable failures in communication. The mistake is to conclude that the scientific mapping of forms of empathic behavior discloses some hidden mechanism to which we can now secure access in order to solve our conflicts. It's one of the tantalizing aspects of our current intellectual climate that we long for resolutions to our problems that do not involve, or at least that short-circuit, the labor of learning within the world of word and image that we constitute over time in our interactions. The truth is that the appeal to nurture empathy or to draw more extensively on its resources is almost entirely an appeal to ordinary imaginative alertness and emotional literacy, of the sort developed in emotionally secure families and in well-constructed programs of humanistic education. Emotional and cultural security form the background for that necessary and radical self-questioning which the empathic stance, in the full sense I've been seeking to trace, requires. What is demanded by the confrontation with the sheer weight and seriousness of the impenetrable other. It's one of our most compulsive habits to search for foreordained scripts for what we do. Eccentrically, we devote great imaginative and intellectual effort to expelling the imaginative and the intellectual from our account of human behavior, framing the life of the agent self as an empty site in which assorted forces play. If the notion of evil could be replaced, as Baron Cohen suggested, by empathy erosion, we have potentially a script in which aberrant human behavior can be tied to operational deficiencies in the brain, so that the role of what we normally mean by agency in aberrant behavior is minimized. To put it another way, it ought, we are told, to be possible to take categories like evil out of the realm of culture and language. If certain behaviors are a matter of events triggering patterns of action already coded for, waiting to happen, they owe little to the processes of learning and symbolizing which we normally associate with intelligent agency. In last night's lecture, I noted in passing that there were obvious cases of situations in which the suspension of habitual emotional response appeared as a learned strategy adopted to enable a particular kind of intervention. Surgery, taking a splinter out of a child's foot. And also that there were all too many unmistakable cases of cultural reinforcement for limiting empathy, in the sense of limiting the definition of those deemed to be worthy of communicating with on the basis of an assumed common humanity. Unless we take seriously the cultural embeddedness of such practices, we shall not address them adequately. Individual emotional identification does not of itself change such things. And that is why in these lectures I've resisted what seems to be a reduction of ethics to a particular kind of emotional formation grounded in neurological mapping. There is no route bypassing language and therefore culture and politics in addressing and redressing inhuman behavior, because what we call inhuman is seen as such in the light of what we learn and hear. Cultural change requires individual emotional intelligence, undoubtedly, but it also requires a developed critical perspective on how we learn in any particular context, an issue which will always have some political resonances. That being said, it is of course essential not to drive a wedge between the educating of our emotions and the transforming of our culture. Quite the contrary. Much of what's been discussed here, including the work of figures like Rose or Stein or Merleau-Ponty, rests on the assumption that we have damaged both our public and our private identities by failing to keep these things connected. A politics of emotional illiteracy, whether left or right, is not transformative. And there are plenty of examples. An education of sensibility that fails to diagnose corporate or national dysfunction will only produce what Hegel called beautiful souls. And crucial to keeping the connection in focus is, I would argue, that emphasis on the body that we've seen in more than one of the thinkers I've been discussing. Empathy for the other, as we've been discussing it, entails the capacity to recognize that I am not able to see my own body as another sees it, that my basic mode of presence in the world is in some central respect inaccessible to me. My own presence in the world, the place from which I cannot withdraw, is a place where I am, to cast it in one register, at the mercy of another's gaze, and in another register, always already indebted to another's gift. There is no way out of this fundamental interdependence, which is what requires us to develop exactly those habits or skills of the prefrontal cortex that allow us to grasp the fluidity and ambiguity of another's communication, and thus something of the nature of their interiority. At the same time, these skills lead us not to identification, but to understanding. As I've said earlier, to a kind of literacy, the ability to read. And as with other sorts of reading, we don't come to definitive conclusions. The text of the other's body is always there to be reread, like any text. What was obscure becomes clearer, and what we thought we had grasped, we now see that we had misread. In this process of reading and rereading one another, we steadily widen our resources in language and cultural equipment, and not least in sheer awareness of our emotional environment within and without. It is at one level entirely true that empathic awareness is the basic condition for resolving human conflict, but not in the sense that emotional identification with the other provides solutions. It is as and when we understand ourselves as dependent, as already seen and engaged with in our bodily limitedness, that we at least begin to look critically at the unexamined agenda of self-regard, individual or collective, and at the myths of self-sufficient identity that we treasure. But that is the beginning, not the end, of the labor we need to find how to speak with each other and shape a fresh cultural environment in which justice is more likely to be done. Thank you.
I'll just introduce you. Thank you so much for another wonderful lecture. Our response this afternoon is by Regina Schwartz, Professor of English at Northwestern University and the author of many imaginative and important books, as you can see in your program notes. Regina, over to you.
Thank you. First, I'm honored to have the opportunity to respond to Dr. Williams and to do so at Harvard, where there are so many people that I admire. And I also want to thank Professor Teskey for allowing me to share his marvelous class today. Dr. Williams has offered us a really richly nuanced discussion of empathy, with the very important caution that when it is sentimentalized into feeling what the sufferer feels, we're at risk of colonizing rather than helping them. And he further cautions, and again, I think this insight is really vital, that seeing such emotional identifications as the panacea for injustice is too easy. First, because if the distance between myself and another could be collapsed, rather than manifesting respect for another, I would be absorbing them. And secondly, because that distance cannot be collapsed, as Edith Stein has demonstrated. His examples of competing empathies have drawn out so helpfully the complexity of the relation of empathy to justice. And he importantly reminds us that to be ethical is not only to feel, but to participate in a world of power and discourse, a world we both shape and are shaped by. I'd like to call attention to a striking feature of today's lecture. It's one thing to invoke Stein to correct over-sentimentalized notions of empathy and to heed her warnings of the risk of violating others with our projections. But he does other valuable work to invoke Stanley Cavell and his discussion of the tragedy of King Lear and knowledge. Is what we suffer as members of an audience of a different kind than the suffering in the moral life that we live outside of the theater? We do watch Lear in horror as he trusts the wrong daughters, and the horror deepens as the magnitude of that mistake unfolds before us and we can do nothing to stop it. Are we as helpless in the arena of political life as we are as spectators of tragedy? And does that helplessness condemn us ultimately to live tragically? Not just to watch injustice now and then in the controlled circumstances of the theater, but watch and only watch it in our world. And if that were so, it would have enormous implications for the horizon Dr. Williams is working under, that of justice. If we are condemned to a kind of paralysis before the distance of another's suffering, if we bear witness to the suffering of others and feel ourselves unable to intervene, how would we begin to act toward making the world a more just place? That is, granted that empathy is inadequate, how do we work toward justice? We're left with that difficult question. Specifically, I want to ask Dr. Williams whether, if we do acknowledge that empathy alone is a crude instrument to achieve justice, do we want to toss out feeling with it, even fellow feeling, feeling for others? We need to avoid Baron Cohen's simplistic assertions that empathy solves the problem of evil, but do we really feel comfortable leaving feeling out of the discourse on justice altogether? Where does this leave us? Allow me to tease out that question by returning to King Lear, and ultimately to question the distinction I just made between theater and life. The relation of feeling to justice is taken up in King Lear repeatedly, and this in a play that critiques many options for framing justice: legal positivism, contracts, natural law, Thrasymachus' rule of the strong, even pre-Kantian categorical imperatives. For instance, the kind of justice that is only the will of the ruling power is dismissed as corruption in a play that begins with Lear exercising his power irresponsibly and insisting that what he rules is law. Come not between the dragon and his wrath, he tells his loyal servant Kent as he banishes him. This same Lear will later acknowledge that arbitrary uses of authority corrupt justice. He asks Gloucester, "Thou hast seen a farmer's dog bark at a beggar, and the creature run from the cur? There thou might behold the great image of authority, a dog's obeyed in office." Law codes are seen as easily corruptible by wealth. Plate sin with gold, and the strong lance of justice hurtless breaks. Armed in rags, a pygmy's straw doth pierce it. I could go on, for the play's preoccupation with injustice has it taking up alternative traditions to expose over and over their inadequacy. And I've written a whole chapter on that, and I'll spare you that right now. Lucky you. But the play does depict feeling, sympathy, as the springboard to acts that are remedial, and it depicts feeling as not altogether impotent. Importantly, it does not opt for empathy, even when it seems to sound that note. Lear tells the blinded Gloucester, "If thou wilt weep my fortunes, take my eyes," acknowledging at once that Gloucester has no eyes to weep, and that Lear's misfortunes require Lear's eyes alone to fully see. That statement is a marvelous rendering of Dr. Williams's point: if you want to weep my life, you would have to take my eyes. You would have to have my viewpoint, which you cannot. Cordelia suffers that her father does, but it's her suffering, not his. He's asleep. "Oh, my dear father, restoration, hang thy medicine on my lips, and let this kiss repair those violent harms that my two sisters have to thy reverence made." The language of repair is inseparable from her sympathy. Her suffering for her father does not render her helpless. Her love restores. Its medicine is on her kissing lips. We must concede that something that we don't call empathy is at work here. But what? Perhaps the work of love. One of the reasons why I prefer the language of love to empathy is that love requires the recognition of the distinctness of the other. Then, too, it is an activity. For Kierkegaard, love is an activity which must be practiced in order to exist at all. You cannot love and do nothing. And love is not so much a feeling as an act in the Bible, too. What is this act of love? I'm going to turn to theology to talk about love and justice now, because political thought has been, with very few exceptions, less helpful on that subject. I have shelves of books on justice in my office that don't have a single chapter on love in them. You know, distributive justice, retributive justice, but there's no chapter on love. Conversely, I don't have any books on justice in religious thought that leave it out. As you well know, and as Dr. Tracy alluded to yesterday, for the prophets, the rabbis, Jesus, Paul, and the fathers, biblical law is summarized by the love commands, to love God and the neighbor. In Leviticus 19:18, thou shalt love the neighbor as thyself, the referent is not restricted to the Israelites. The stranger is explicitly included among those one is enjoined to love. You shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Sometimes the Bible says love the neighbor and sometimes love the stranger, and if you get confused thinking that the neighbor is a stranger and the stranger is a neighbor, that may be just Dr. Williams's point. That is, those we think we know, the neighbor, are in fact inaccessible. But also, however distant, this stranger is completely vital to our sense of ourselves and our own interiority, and hence is our neighbor. But what does love have to do with justice, which is, after all, the horizon informing Dr. Williams' interest in correcting our over-sentimental understandings of empathy? After all, usually justice is defined as separated from love by an impassable gap. Justice is calculable, finite, informed by structures of power, even when they're consensual and contractual, that legislate by means of rulemaking and will by enforcing. Love seems to inhabit another world altogether. Rather than being calculating, it knows no rules, no bounds, is infinite, immeasurable, and it seems largely oblivious to power. So what is love the stranger doing weirdly in the context of commandments, laws, that are overwhelmingly preoccupied with social justice, like don't steal or bear false witness or covet what belongs to somebody else and don't kill, and love the stranger, which is the sum of all of them? While the command to love may refer to a feeling on some level, this context suggests another emphasis. The command to love appears with injunctions about how to treat others justly. To love one's fellow is to comprehend his needs here and to respond to them. The widow, the orphan, and the stranger are singled out in the account of those to whom we owe justice. And these are not people we would describe as autonomous individuals claiming the right to respect, so much as people in need. The model seems to be of humans, not as brutish, self-interested, aggressive, and competitive, the model Hobbes has bequeathed, nor as autonomous and choosing their course freely, the Kantian legacy, but as needing, as hungry, dispossessed, lonely, mourning, and lacking protection. To be just is to love these people, that is, to recognize and provide for their needs. The Bible suggests that what we do when we love is give. The Hebrew word for love, ahava, has the root hava, of to give, so that it means both to love and to give. It is he who sees justice done for the orphan and the widow, who loves the stranger and gives him food and clothing. Love the stranger, then, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This love issues in concrete action. You are neither to strip your vine bare, nor to collect the fruit that has fallen in your vineyard. You must leave them for the poor and the stranger. Such justice is no matter of convention or a product of an agreement, whether this obligation to give is incumbent upon all of us. It's not dependent upon the presence of any particular virtue in a person, nor is it specifically a response to their claim that we recognize their dignity. It is that, but more. The obligation to give is primarily our response to another's need. The stranger and the poor in Leviticus 19:10 are presumed to need the fruit of the vineyard. Hence, it's just that I leave some for them. Furthermore, responding to need is how God describes his love of the people at the beginning of the Exodus narrative. I have seen the miserable state of my people in Egypt. I have heard their appeal to be rid of their slave drivers. I am aware of their sufferings, and I mean to deliver them. And so, in King Lear, Cordelia sees the miserable state of her father. She grieves at the news of his mistreatment, and she amasses an army. Critics have often noted the striking biblical allusion she makes. "O Father, it is thy business that I go about," invoking Christ's mission. But again, heeding the context is revealing, because her pious-sounding statement is surrounded by her description of sending an army into England to restore it to her father. Our preparation stands, she says, in expectation of them. O Father, it is thy business that I go about. No blown ambition does our arms incite, but love, dear love, and our aged father's right. Love musters an army to protect her father's right. Love seeks justice. When Lear, suffering in the storm, enters the hovel, he notes the suffering of others. You all know this. In, boy, go first, you houseless poverty, nay, get thee in. Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm. How shall your houseless heads and unfed sides defend you from such seasons as these? Oh, I've taken too little care of this. The cure for the rulers who've been blind to this injustice is for them to suffer. Take physic pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayest shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just. This is not quite empathy, to experience the homeless's experience, for this is a self-dispossessed king, not a beggar. But it is to suffer, and this will impel justice. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou may shake the superflux to them. This is gleaning the fields from Leviticus, and this lesson in distributing resources justly, gleaning the fields, shaking the superflux, is also learned by Gloucester when he suffers. In his blindness, he worries about clothing the naked madman who leads him, with no idea that it's his son, Edgar. As Gloucester stumbles toward what he thinks will be the cliffs of Dover, where he plans to fall to his death, he gives his purse to his poor guide. Here, take this purse, thou whom the heavens' plagues have humbled to all strokes. Heavens, deal so still. Let the superfluous and lust-dieted man that slaves your ordinance, defies your commands, that will not see because he does not feel your power quickly. So distribution should undo excess, and each man have enough. Gleaning the fields, shaking the superflux, distribution undoing excess. Those who fail to act justly are those who will not see because they will not feel, says the blind man, movingly. Like Dr. Tracy, I want to return to the question of the neighbor. Is it one's countrymen, his kinsmen, or a reference to all strangers, to all others, making the command a universal one? The Hebrew is re'akah, and it's been translated helpfully as fellow man. How does Leviticus depict him? First, as the poor and the stranger. Our fellow man is someone who doesn't have enough, so we must feed him, as we've seen. But the fellow is also depicted in Leviticus as including someone who can be exploited, lied to, robbed, someone whose wages can be withheld, someone who can be slandered, it names all of these, who can be hated, and someone, moreover, from whom that hatred can be hidden instead of having his offense openly explained to him, defining harm far more broadly than contemporary liberal rights does. And the list also includes someone who cannot speak and someone who cannot see. In short, one's fellow's man is not figured here as a fortress of strength, of self-sufficiency, or autonomy, the modern imaginary subject whose right to freedom must be protected. No, the fellow human, from the poor to the stranger, from one who offends unknowingly to one who engages with misplaced trust, from the speechless to the blind, is again the very portrait of vulnerability. And what does it mean to love such a person? To respect him indeed, but far more, to help him. Granted, this biblical understanding of justice as loving the fellow the stranger, expressed as giving to those who are in need, is not the same as our usual understandings of justice, as fulfilling a contract, duty to the moral law, a calculus of utility, distributing equitably or in just proportion, or retribution for an injury. Giving to those in need is not quite based on their desert, their merits, nor is it precisely the same as their right. Although attention to the dignity of others is certainly implicit in this love command, one's dignity is not the same as one's vulnerability. What the fellow claims is not his right, his freedom to possess his goods or pursue his ends without interference. What he claims is my responsibility to care for him. We are a long way from the vision of a person presupposed by modern liberal thought, the self-imagined I'm quoting now, I'm quoting your colleague, Michael Sandel, separate individual person, each with his own aims, interests, and conceptions of the good life, freed from the sanctions of custom and tradition and inherited status, and unbound by moral ties. If our model of the human person is not that of the individual, bound by her consciousness, her body, her soul, her conscience, but of a person embedded in a deep network of association from which she would cease to be if she were cut off from her past, her future, her present, her neighbors, her strangers, then the unavoidable implication of their well-being in her well-being and vice versa is the starting ground. And the ethical challenge becomes not so much to avoid co-opting another's feeling, but to find the resources within and without to respond to another's need. Much of the fiction of liberal individualism as self-sufficient, autonomous, with self-interested aims gives rise to the anxiety of co-opting another autonomous, self-sufficient experience. Even the fiction of the self in phenomenology, that we are bounded by our bodies and no others through the recognition that their bodies are like ours, gives rise to Husserl's anxiety in the fifth Cartesian meditation that we're condemned to solipsism, and his worry that we are only capable of projections. But long before we have any sense of our autonomy, we respond with a smile to our mother's smile. She constitutes us, giving and loving. Not surprisingly, Lear's brutal renunciation of his own child is replete with the discourse of the stranger. Here I disclaim all my paternal care, propinquity, and property of blood, and as a stranger to my heart and me hold thee from this forever. Then, having thoroughly estranged her, he heaps on more, claiming that he would hold her as the most alien of all strangers, the barbarous Scythian, or he that makes his generation messes to gorge his appetite, shall to my bosom be as well neighbored, pitied, and relieved as thou, my sometime daughter. This echoes perversely the biblical injunction to neighbor the stranger, to pity and relieve him, and Lear will not grant this even to his daughter. In this way, the play weaves the command to love the stranger, for Cordelia has been strangered, into the core of its plot. Lear must learn to love the stranger, or will never be ethical and will never be Lear. And what about the audience and the relation between this theatrical experience and the ethical world outside? What does the audience experience? We suffer when Lear is turned out of doors, when Gloucester is blinded, when Lear and Gloucester commiserate, when Lear and Cordelia are imprisoned, and perhaps most, when Cordelia dies. We're so devastated by that end that the experience is unbearable. And that's why for 150 years, audiences saw a rewritten, happier ending. We sympathize with Lear, and we may even learn to love this seeming monster, this stranger. And I would argue if we're touched at all, we are changed by this play. We can't leave the play apprehending the same world we did when we entered. We see power, privilege, and authority with a jaundiced eye, and we see those who suffer as demanding our care. And so not just our world is changed, we too are, as we're reoriented. The arresting image of this orientation toward the other occurs when Lear discovers Cordelia. The once banished daughter now asks for her father's blessing, and the suffering Lear awakens from his madness and begs her forgiveness. "Oh, look upon me, sir, and hold your hand in benediction over me. No, sir, you must not kneel." Surely this is a scene of recognition and not avoidance. Cordelia is as much constituted by her father's blessing as Lear is by her forgiveness. And understanding this, Lear does not want it to be of a moment but perpetual. He imagines this poignant kneeling contest as continual in a paradisal prison. "Come, let's away to prison. We two alone will sing like birds in the cage. When thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask thy forgiveness. So we'll live and pray and sing and tell old tales." Suffering may be only the beginning and not the end of an approach to justice. It doesn't sort out the complexity of competing claims, of distributing fairly to all of those in need, or responding fairly to injuries. But I do want to see it on the justice map. Whether inside or outside the theater, one can only live differently when he sees himself and others differently. And on that point, I would venture to say, Rowan Williams and Williams Shakespeare agree.
So let's begin a conversation. Rowan, do you want to respond to some of those points?
Thank you, thank you. First of all, Regina, thank you so much for a wonderfully suggestive and rich reply. We could talk about Lear all night, I suspect.
And probably will.
Let's just pick up 2 or 3 points very briefly. First of all, I think on the helplessness with which you started, the being a spectator, the paralysis of the drama. I take it that the point made there is, that is, if you like, a necessary ascetical therapeutic moment. It's not a model of our response to suffering or even an insight into the nature of our response. It is obliging us to silence before the suffering of another for a sufficient period, as it were, for us to say to ourselves, there will always be what I cannot do for the other. And then I've got to go out and do it, or do what is doable. And I think that's my reading of that.
I've often thought of you as a prophet of patience. Does that sound comfortable to you?
I hate being called a prophet, but patience.
But you often counsel patience, as you did after 9/11. You know, watch, listen, and be patient.
But that being said, let me come on to your main point about feeling. And I think you've rightly identified in what I've said a little bit of pushing the pendulum to a far end to say, watch out for feeling because we're awash with it. And in a society where cruelty and sentimentality often go hand in hand, one has to puncture a bit. But what you say is, I think, absolutely correct about feeling and justice, and I would connect it with a number of things. For example, when Wittgenstein talks about education by suffering at a certain level, how certain concepts are accessible only as a result of the experience of suffering, I think that's an important part of the map somewhere. And I think in Lear, one of the most significant images towards the end, of course, is precisely awakening. Not even just emotional education, but emotional awakening. And I think, of course, of the end of The Winter's Tale, it is required that you awake your faith. Certain things are only enacted when awakening has occurred, and that is to do with feeling, with perceiving, with a whole range of sensual images for our presence in the world. So I would absolutely endorse the need for bringing the language of feeling and indeed the language of love into a discourse of justice. And I think it's not irrelevant in thinking this through that in the Augustinian tradition, the point of love for the neighbor and indeed the stranger is a sort of fixed will that the other's well-being be as firmly established as one's own. One's own desire for well-being or security becomes inseparable from the desire, the passionate desire, for the well-being and security of the other. And I think that's how Augustine very much sees in the City of God how the reign of love operates. And I think that is, odd as it may sound, a form of justice, that to desire for the other the security one desires for oneself, for every other to be secure and well-being in the way one would desire for oneself, and with the energy and the hunger, you might almost say, one desires for oneself. That seems to me to fill out, to body out, literally, what we say about justice.
Wonderful. Thank you.
May I ask maybe one question to draw these themes together before opening it up to the audience? And it's really about the nurturing of the empathic stance and how it links between the personal and the public, or justice, if you like. And it really has to do with the resources that you delineate that produces the empathic stance. You talk about emotionally secure families and good parenting and a good humanistic education and literature and drama and the cultivation of imagination, the labor of learning, all of these things. But it kind of struck me that in a way these are the resources of the privileged minority to some extent in our world. And I was kind of wondering how you think we can, apart from investing more in these resources, which I understand, how do we translate the message of your lectures into something approaching wider realization among populations and cities and conflict zones who often have deficiencies in the resources you identify?
The person who first put me onto Sue Gerhardt's work on this was a youth worker in South London who said that there was no point at all in approaching the alienated and confused and disadvantaged young people on the streets of South London unless one had a fairly robust grasp of the physical and neurological as well as social problems that they experienced. And she has, I think, done a great deal in her own sphere to open up that discussion. So for me, this came out of a very practical set of questions posed by the conditions of some of the people living 100 yards away from in Lambeth over the last 10 years. And I think it's easy sometimes to characterize secure families and humanistic resources as the natural possession of the elite. The question is, what actually does nourish emotional intelligence in those who don't have that access or that advantage? And I think that's a very interesting question to which there are lots and lots of answers, because of course people do live with imagination, with courage and with resource in situations like that. And mapping that and going with the grain of it, I think is vastly important. I'm thinking again of this particular friend and the work that she does in South London. She has devoted a career to encouraging art and drama projects with her young friends, devoted her time to a really intense affirmation of their capacity, which is also highly critical and very challenging. She managed to persuade the Tate Modern Gallery in London to give over their top floor to an exhibition of the work of some of these youngsters and gave it high profile in the press. It can be done, and I would be very sorry if we thought that what we were talking about was, again, the refined sensitivities of a high culture. It's much more a matter of looking at what it is that grows that sense of emotional solidity in people who frequently have been, in every sense, abused by the society and the environment they're in. For those who haven't heard of her, the woman I'm talking about is called Kamila Batmanghelidj. She's an Iranian, half Belgian, and the most creative youth worker in the United Kingdom for my money. And I am happy to pay public tribute to one of the most remarkable women I know. She's written a bit about this, and if ever you come across her, the name is memorable, as she is in person. She's worth knowing about.
Thank you. It's a good answer. So shall we open it up? Or,
Oh, yeah, sure.
So we have some time for questions. Please identify yourself when you make a question. And try and keep the question pretty short. Try not to make it the third Tanner lecture. So, Homie, you want a question? So, the microphone will find its way.
I wonder how you might use empathy as a critique for institutions. You know, I can see what you're talking about in ethical relationality of people, communities, the dialogic, but you know, is the church today an empathic institution? I mean, I'm interested to see it as a critique of institutions. My second little point, it really is about empathy and affect. And the ambivalence of affect and ambiguity, as David was talking about last time. The question of, you know, the things we all have, violence internally, and I think Julian Rose talks quite a lot about that. So empathy and affect. And I would say that the mood of Julian Rose's Hegelianism is melancholy. The dominant mood is melancholy. So things like melancholia, which I think are very important issues. And finally, the issue of empathy. You talked about embodiment, but you didn't seem to talk enough about enunciation and representation. You talked about the representation of the body in a certain way, but if, for instance, egotistical projection is the negative form of, you know, the imposition of one's sovereignty on another, either the suffering or whatever, and leads to a kind of sentimentality. I was just wondering what are the more affirmative forms of representation, and what happens to the whole realm of enunciation, language and representation, which in your other works you've talked about more than here. Like yesterday when I quoted you, you know, when you talked about the grammar of love. If we follow the grammar of love rather than its spirit, you know, I just wanted to go back to that book. So those are the issues. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you. Material there for a whole conference, as they say. Institutions. One of the things which I think what I've been talking about provides as a basis for looking at a whole range of institutional life is, obviously, the patterns and mechanisms of exclusion in institutions. No institution is wholly comprehensive, unconditionally inclusive. Institutions have purposes, purposes make their own selections. I think some fundamental understanding of the, if you like, the shakiness of the insider's position, the always to be questioned shakiness of the insider's position, just gives one that continuing critical needle about forms of exclusion. Not that it therefore, as it becomes impossible to exclude anybody because you feel so deeply for them, but you are always asking yourself, why this decision? Why this person? And unsettling that. I think that's how this feeds into institutional life, which I think comes back to another point I wanted just to touch on in response to Regina, if I can put this in brackets, which has something to do with the fact that what this offers us is, or might offer us, is some tools for diagnosing illegitimate, emotionally illiterate, emotionally damaged and damaging forms of scapegoating and exclusion. Which takes me on a bit to your question about representation, which in a slightly different mode I've discussed a bit in the Gifford lectures last year. If I read someone like Julian Rose again correctly, and you're right about her melancholic register, representation is always necessary, always challengeable. It is, in some sense, an act of faith. and affirmable as such, and as an act of faith, also something other than an act of possession. And I think the challenge of any theory of representation is negotiating that line, always challengeable, and yet trustful. That trust may be betrayed or shattered, but it's not empty. And in a sense, that's where my theological background kicks in. We talk about God in the trust that we're not talking complete nonsense, and the uncomfortable certainty that we just might be, and we continue to do the necessary speaking and the necessary questioning. And I think what we say there applies in a range of thoughts about representation. And affect, empathy and affect, and what he was saying about emotional tonality. I mentioned...
The things we have to effectively fight within ourselves
Yes.
in order to be our best selves, that process.
Yes, yes. Things we fight within ourselves in order to be our best selves, yes. I think that has to do with, again, this significance of proper self-scrutiny, a term that Julian was very fond of. And what was I going to say? Yes, I mentioned in the lecture that the kind of position I was working towards was one in which we understood both comedy and tragedy as forms of carrying imaginatively the effects of self-ignorance. Sometimes it's significant that we respond comically, sometimes it's significant that we respond tragically. The uncovering in various circumstances, in response to various conditions, the uncovering of incongruity, the incongruity of what we don't know, is sometimes comic and sometimes tragic. Shakespeare, every page. So that it would be a mistake, I think, to read the empathic stance as committed to, let's say, a melancholic program. And I've got a suspicion that Julian Rose might agree with that.
Other questions? Yes, so in the middle of the row, and then the lady with there, yeah, so those will be the next two. Yep. And just beside you there, yes. Yeah. So take this one first. Yep.
Hello. Thanks very much for coming to speak to us. My name is Tim Manis. I am a doctoral student in science and religion at Boston University. I seem to have heard it implied over the course of the past couple of nights that the neurological research of people like Baron Cohen is in itself a sort of failed attempt at empathy. It's saying that the qualitatively rich experiences of empathy in the mind of this other person are fully explained by this set of propositions that I've got in my own mind. And that now that I have these set of propositions, we can go forth and redefine our notions of evil and ethics and all this other business. So that seems to raise some questions. I mean, surely the particular qualitative nature of these feelings of empathy that make it, that characterize it as empathy within the minds of each person aren't things that science can come to grips with very well. But on the other hand, it seems as though we can't just say of all of human experience, well, this is something that science can't comprehend, we're going to forbid research in this area. So can you comment on the proper ethics and the proper epistemology for scientists studying human experience? What can we say that we know based on these studies, and what should we claim based on that knowledge?
Thank you. That's a very interestingly framed question, from where you begin with this as it were a misconceived attempt at empathy in precisely the sense of trying to contain what you're relating to. And isn't that part of the answer to the ethical question that you ended with? In any intellectual endeavor, to put it in rather old-fashioned, not to say medieval or pre-medieval terms, the question is, are we seeking to comprehend, or are we seeking to participate? Are we seeking to be aligned to the truth that is acting upon us, or are we seeking to make it passive to our activity? And I think whether we're talking about science or humanities, that's an interesting ethical baseline to work from. I think an ethical science is always deeply, seriously an attempt to be attuned to the agency that we are encountering, rather than just the attempt to freeze and immobilize and surround what's there. And my sense is that the evolution of, let's say, physics out of its classical mode, out of its Newtonian mode, is more and more a recognition that there's something more like attunement than like possession going on here. So that's the area in which I think I want to respond.
So we have a question here.
Thank you. Yes, hello. Kathy George. I'm an Episcopal priest and an adjunct professor of pastoral theology. And Dr. Williams, thank you for your treatment of empathy, helping us understand that its erosion is not a comprehensive definition of evil. Could you recommend to us the working theological definition that you have of evil?
Of evil. Right. I've got enough Augustinian blood in my veins, I think, to say that I begin by looking at evil as denial. Ultimately, the denial of who we are, in whatever way that comes up. And insofar as who we are is, in Christian theology, the image of our Maker and our source, then the denial of God, by which I don't just mean being an atheist, I mean the rebellion against what is true, what is life-giving, is evil. The Augustinian language about evil as privation is often misunderstood to mean that evil is, if you like, just a lack. But as Augustine himself makes clear, as you might say, a vacuum has power. It draws things in. Similarly, denial, although it is a negation, it's not an affirmation of anything or any reality, it has an energy of its own. And the force of denial of self, denial of one's finitude, denial of one's dependence, denial of one's capacity, denial of one's interrelatedness, denial of one's createdness, all of those things suck in energy as in a black hole. That's how I'd start talking about evil.
There was right in the back. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering how, in your opinion, how empathy can be trained for children grow up in a different environment, maybe have a different definitions of how they understand the very word of empathy, around how their parents define the word, and how their great-grandparents and great-grandparents define the word, especially in China. A lot of times, it's a very disciplined empathy. So it can be totally misinterpreted here in America, or even in another Asian country, like Korea, Japan, or Philippines. So I was wondering, in a micro school, how will you train and teach kids to have a closer understanding or closer definition of how the rest of us understand here? Thank you.
Thank you. I feel I'd like to hear you at greater length on this, because I'm guessing on the intercultural front. But I think I'd want to say that in almost any cultural setting, some of our training in empathy in the widest sense comes not only from telling children stories, but helping children tell stories. Tell me what you think it would be like to, is, I find, always an interesting challenge with the child. Tell me what you think it would be like to be, to do. And I don't think that's culture specific. I think in every culture, our exposure to challenging narratives as we grow up, and fairy tales are challenging narratives at times, begins to open us up in that respect. And the next stage then is to say, well, tell me the story. But would you like to say a bit more about how you see this in the context of non-Western, non-European cultures? Because this is really interesting.
Well, I did some service teaching in Singapore, Spain and Greece, and I was teaching Chinese language and culture. So sometimes we come across stories like, how is your childhood like? The student will ask me, and because I was saying, you guys are so lucky because, you have a very open environment here, not as competitive. You don't have to save face for your parents and grandparents because it's a highly competitive culture in China, and the only child only make it worse because it's a big social problem.
Yes.
So I think the discipline empathy, what I was saying earlier, was it's a very direct, aggressive, family environment, I think, to a lot of Chinese families. And that kind of empathy and that kind of skill of having that empathy, it's very hard sometimes when parents and grandparents are raised in a sharp way, in a way that may not have that much nurturing. So that's what I was saying. How can they change when they move here to study in America and can be more empathetic to other, classmates and kids and teachers and people around them? And that's one of the concerns to the parents who are thinking about sending their kids to study in the U.S. from China.
Now thank you. That's as I say, a really interesting set of questions. Just two thoughts, if I may, on that. One is, I have a sense, rightly or wrongly, that one of the problems that sometimes arises for people coming from East Asian cultures is a mixture of, as you say, what can be quite a directive, traditional form of upbringing and a developed, sort of exported, capitalist, competitive style, which just turns the screw a bit further on that. And one of the things that needs doing, I guess, is disentangling some of those things. The second is that I'm aware in the British academic context of exactly the challenges you described, students from other cultures arriving in a less directive environment. But I would say that how we encourage one another to tell stories becomes an important part of that, to tell and listen to. This is how I learned what I think I know. I suspect that's one of the most important things we can ever be saying. This is how I learned what I think I know. Tell me how you learned what you think you know, and maybe we discover how deep that knowledge is or how secure it is and what we can say to each other.
We have time for one more question up here.
Paul Colbert. One of the most remarkable things about the contemporary discourse of empathy is that it's become very important for us to say that God has empathy, and what we mean by that is that God suffers like us, feels what we feel, is subject to time and in the historical process. And how you've redefined empathy, is that the sort of thing that is worth continuing to tell people about God? Or if God is not empathetic in the way of being like us, then what are we even talking about?
Well, lots I could say about that. I confess to a real unease about the way in which we've, in the last couple of decades, gone for this model of divine engagement with the world, because I'm cautious of the way in which it seems sometimes simply to make God another subject of emotion. And therefore, by definition, someone who has an agenda, as persons do. For me, the liberating thing about a rather austere classical definition of God's freedom from passion is that it tells me God has no agenda. God has no interests to defend or promote. And therefore, to speak of the love of God is to speak of that which is very drastically unlike the love we negotiate, exchange, sometimes barter. It's not like that. And I want to reach for some Buddhist help there, really, to reaffirm something about the radicality of divine love. This is to go right into the theological territory, but it does seem to me that there are some major conceptual difficulties in thinking of a God who empathizes in a simplistic sense, and there are some really liberating and enlarging things about setting that language aside and saying, well, whatever the love of God is, it's not a fellow feeling, with respect to your defense of that term, Regina. It's not quite that. Yes, we say of the incarnation of God in Jesus that the only way we can picture the love of God in action is as if God were experiencing the torments of a tortured criminal. That is the best picture we've got of God. But that's not to say that God, so to speak, felt Lear-like. He had to expose himself to feel what wretches feel because he hadn't been adequately loving beforehand, as if God recognized with some compunction in about 4 BCE that he needed to get out more. It's not. And I'm sorry, I'm not being entirely serious, but that's the area of my worry. I want something a bit more alarming and challenging than that in what I say about the love of God. The interest-free, the agenda-free bestowal of life, which is God's action.
I just love how funny the thought of God being locked out in a storm is when I think of Lear. To me, I mean, it's exactly your point. Yeah.
Okay, one more question. You have the last word.
My name is Caroline Horn. Just want to talk about women. In Shakespeare and King Lear, or you've talked about the cultural side of empathy. Historically, most cultures don't just either associate women with sense of justice or none at all, or to be idiotic about it. We haven't talked anything. Feminists have done a great deal of work to bring back emotional intelligence, what you talk about, into the public sphere, into philosophy, theology. Is there anything about, culturally speaking, about women and the sense of empathy, of justice, that you can talk about that? The church has not given women the role that you've had as a figure of justice. Is there anything to say about the feminist work that's been done over the last 40 years about this very issue?
Oh, right. That's a very, very important area, which, again, I think could take us a long time. And I'd like to hear Regina on this as well. But just a brief comment. 3 things maybe to note. First of all, this is going to be a slightly dialectical reply. First of all, it does seem to me that we are inheritors, as I think you're implying, of a downgrading of emotion as in some context a way of knowing things. A downgrading of knowledge that is not arm's length or detached or objectifying. And we have inherited that. We are gradually understanding a bit better the nature of embodied, gendered, knowing and all that that means. We don't know as thinking reeds, brains on stalks or whatever. And that's an important but slow and patchy cultural change. Second, a bit of caution to myself and others, having said that, let's not imagine that emotion belongs with the feminine and reason belongs with the masculine. That's, that way madness lies. We've done that before and it's worked very badly. But we do need, as Ian McGilchrist argues in the book I quoted on the hemispheres of the brain, we do need a sense of the irreducible interaction of kinds of knowing in male and female subjects. Third thing, just to put in here, is the fact which I find deeply shocking, that we're in a world where gender-based, gender-related violence is rising constantly and is often used in conflict in developing nations as a deliberate tool of war and humiliation and intimidation. And simply to say that one of my most earnest hopes and prayers is that institutions like the Church and others will continue to give the highest possible priority to naming and attempting to eradicate that horrific cultural trend in parts of our current world. And I think to do that, not only on the basis of what you might call a generalized awareness of the unspeakable injustice that women suffer in those circumstances, but also as a way of challenging some of the toxic myths of masculinity and power that go with those practices.
Add anything?
Well, the only thing I would add is that there's a sense in which the subtext in both of your lectures could powerfully be women, because you're emphasizing the alterity that needs to be respected rather than projecting either one's desire or one's feeling onto another. And since an awful lot of our cultural projections are those of men onto women, and your interest is in restoring the integrity of the otherness of the other, I think women are deeply implicated in what you're suggesting and have everything to gain from taking, we have everything to gain from the world listening to you. I really think that, because I remember the first time I read Husserl as a woman, I was just kind of appalled. I mean, really, when we get to the solipsism and the projection, and how difficult it is for him to imagine intersubjectivity, and then it's so interesting to me that Edith Stein is the one who can come along and work on that problem. So you're picking up from her makes all kind of sense to me.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Rowan Williams and Regina Schwartz for really stimulating conversation.